Our biggest shadow issue, as Jung pointed out, is that we live small lives. And that's a significant statement, I think, that our understandable need for safety, satiety, for security, these things can prevail, and we can collude with shutting down our own talents or callings or capacities.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Deborah Burnt Maldonado. I'm here with Dr. Rob Maldonado, and we have a special guest on our podcast today, Dr. James Hollis, author of many books, Jungian analyst, and we're so excited to share that interview. But before we begin, I would love for you to click the button here on the corner if you're watching us on YouTube to subscribe to our channel so you do not miss an episode. So we had an incredible interview with Dr. Hollis.
Yeah, well, it's a dream come true for me. You know, we always half jokingly ask ourselves, if this was a dream, how would we interpret this? Mm-hmm. For us, Dr. Hollis represents the archetypal man of knowledge, holding up the lamp of wisdom so that everyone can find their true path. So it's a special interview that we did, and he's just full of wisdom. So generous with his time, so willing to share his knowledge of Jungian psychology. So thank you for tuning in.
And I had many, many goosebumps during that interview. So we can't wait for you to hear it. So it's coming right now.
Welcome to the podcast. We're here with Dr. James Hollis, speaker, professor, Jungian analyst, and best-selling author of over, 15, 16 books now, or 17?
Well, it's 19, I think. But it was
19 books. Excellent. And his latest book, A Life of Meaning, examines the qualities that bring meaning to our human journey. I love this title too, Relocating Your Center of Spiritual Gravity. All right, because that for us is the aim of individuation, right? It's to kind of cut ourselves loose from this over-identification with a persona to moving to a more spiritual center, a more genuine, true center, the self, as Jung called it. So welcome, sir. Appreciate it. I was hoping we could start with the individuation process and the phases of it. And I'm particularly interested in what's going on psychologically in the individual, those psychological energies, that energy system that makes the psyche work. What changes within that psychology as people go through individuation? And I wanted to start with a quote by Edward O. Wilson to kind of put us in the context that we're in right now in our world. So he says, the real problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
Yes, indeed. I think we all are aware that the world has sort of slipped out of our hands, as it were, as if it were ever in our hands. So, we're close to the process of individuation as infants because we're governed by instinct. And instinct tells us what is right for the organism, whatever it may be. But as we all know, we're tiny, vulnerable, dependent on our environment. And so we start making adaptations and we start making interpretations. And we ask ourselves, is the other reliable or not? Is the other something I can approach, or do I need to keep my distance? We learn basic strategies of adaptation and survival in our earliest days. And the greater the adaptations, potentially the greater the separation that one experiences from one's own core. And so that's why the world of psychopathology exists. And when I use the word psychopathology, it's not a judgment in any way. It's simply a description of our disturbances and our interrupted relationships with our own instinctual and soulful life. And so the whole project of life is, to what degree can you serve that which is wishing expression in the world through you, which may or may not have anything to do with your ego comforts, may or may not have anything to do with making you wealthy or successful by social standards, but is something in you that is imperious, that's demanding, that is wishing expression. And it's about becoming who you are. And that's why we're here in the first place. Each of us is a tiny chip in a large mosaic. And We may feel insignificant at times, but then you take those chips away, and what is the mosaic? It's deprived. So individuation is simply a word for the natural developmental process that's built into us genetically, and struggle to recover a relationship to it and to serve that rather than, serve whatever the environmental demands might be at any given moment.
Absolutely. How do we do this? I mean, given that we know now there's a strong genetic component, right, to behavior. The behavioral genetics has kind of given us a different perspective than in Jung's time of what forces are shaping our personality.
Mm-hmm.
So we have behavioral genetics, we have epigenetics now, our understanding of how our forefathers' experiences are passed down to us and how we inherit those processes. And also, of course, the powerful force of conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
the things we experience in our families and in our culture. Given all those elements, how is it that we start to develop this sense of self that we call the ego, the persona?
Well, the sense of self is quite different than the self. And when Jungians talk about the self, it's with a capital S, so to speak. It's
Right.
it's that organizing developmental agenda that's built into our nature. Our sense of self is our conscious understanding of that. And of course, our sense of self can be highly dependent upon what's happening around us. In other words, if we ask ourselves, why should a child be scarred by or influenced by, say, poverty or disease or alcoholism or racism or whatever, because it's outside of them? Well, of course, every child is reading the world to try to see what its message is. What do you think about me? Who am I in relationship to you? And how am I to conduct myself? And what is safe and what is unsafe, and so forth. So again, there's a kind of inherent conflict between socialization and the natural growth and development. Now, obviously, some socialization is necessary. And a lot of that socialization is productive and helpful. We learn to stop at stop signs. We learn to look both ways before we cross the street. We learn to use a knife and fork, etc. These are hardly impositions upon the self trying to self, if you will. But when it comes to fitting in, being adaptive, feeling permission to be who you are, to desire what you desire, to undertake the projects that speak to you, that's a whole different question. And most of us have a very conditional sense of self. I can do this or do that if such and such is true, or if I'm a good person, then these things are available to me and these things are not, and so forth. And yet there's always a deep yearning in the psyche for self-expression, and not from a conscious standpoint or not even an ego standpoint. It's more about what is it that is wishing expression through me. And the neurobiologists have much to teach us, of course, but the thing that is missing in their considerations is that we are that meaning-seeking, meaning-creating animal, and we suffer terribly when we're disconnected from meaning. As Jung said once, the smallest of things with meaning is always larger than the largest of things without meaning. And therefore, we experience the disconnect from meaning, and something inside of us sickens and is in grave peril. And that's where most human beings are, because we are creatures of adaptation. That's how we survived. That's how we managed on this planet. At the same time, as I suggested before, the greater the adaptation, potentially the greater the disconnect from inside. And then that rises as a kind of protest from the psyche by symptomatology, a loss of connection, loss of meaning, a depression, whatever form it takes. And it's that we tend to treat rather than the underlying problem is, does this person have a sense of permission to live their journey? I found that most individuals don't feel a deep sense of permission. Life, because we learned early, life is conditional, and you have to meet the condition to be acceptable. Even love becomes a kind of test, as it were. My parents will love me if I do X and Y. They won't if I do something else. And that carries over into adult life. And so the recovery of permission and the recovery of personal authority, that is to say, from the multitudes of desires and pressures upon us at any given moment, which voices come from the depths and which ones are true for me, and can I find the courage to live them in this world? That's where we find ourselves on a daily basis.
Incredible. So the image that I get is that because we are social creatures and we need to fit into the tribe and the family and the social system, that we sacrifice our true nature, our essence, in a sense, that we feel survival is more important at this point. I have to establish a beachhead in life, and the only way I can do it is through the development and the identification with this ego persona that will give me that safety, right? That people won't reject me. They won't think I'm strange. I'll fit in. I'll do that. And so is that the creation of the shadow, that we push away or we hide what's not adaptive to us?
No, that's well said. We do tend to repress or impose on others what is not acceptable and what is not permitted to us. And again, we suffer a dis-ease inside because we are separating from some of our most vital energies. You know, the persona is a Greek word that means mask, after all, and originally came from para and sonar, to sound. In other words, what the sound comes through, but who you really are is masked. And the opposite of the mask, in a sense, is my full humanity, which includes elements which I or my society reject or control, and therefore become shadow material. And so the ego consciousness is sort of whipsawed between them from time to time. And again, if we serve only the persona world, we will be shallow. We will be shallow creatures. We'll be creatures of adaptation.
Right.
I think much of life is on automatic pilot, and we live perhaps possibly for decades, simply stimulus response, until something comes to a person that says, no, this can't be permitted to continue, or I have to change something, or this is what life is calling me to do. And we could say, and this is a very crude distinction, but the first half of life is about building that ego world. In other words, I leave my parents, I step out into the world, I say to an employer, hire me, you can trust me to show up and do the job that you're paying me for. We form a relationship, trust me in this relationship because I'll meet you halfway and so forth. And then having done all of that, somewhere around 35, 40, 45, 50, one begins to say, and where do we go from here? Right. What's this about really? What is my journey, since I've already in some way achieved these goals in life? Where am I to go from here? I mean, so you have to remember, in 1900, the average length of life in North America, US and Canada, was 47. So we've virtually doubled that in our time. And one could say, having served the biological functions of reproducing the species and becoming socially adaptive creatures, why are we still here? Nature doesn't need us anymore. And how are we to live our life? And that's already raising questions of the life of the spirit, which is to say, all right, to what values do I give myself? What is my calling here? Who am I apart from my achievements in life, or my resume, or my house in the suburbs, and so forth? All of these things begin to rise for a person, and the meaning of their life, I think, is the degree to which they're willing to address those questions head on in the second half of life. That's sort of how you get your life back again. However, I want to emphasize this. Many times, the price of not going is the death of the spirit. The price of leaving the conventional is to experience some form of exile. And one has to be willing to accept one's exile from the conventional standards in order to step into your journey. I don't mean this in this adolescent sense of flaunting authorities or anything like that. That's very infantile, as I said. Right. But finding that if you don't serve what is wanting expression through you, there's some terrible deformation of the soul, and the soul will respond symptomatically, and we'll have what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death, which is that terrible depression that leads to despair.
Yeah, in my early work, I did a lot of psychotherapy, and there was this sense of hopelessness and emptiness, right? These lethal levels of meaninglessness that people experience that literally just shatter the person's view of themselves and their life, right? What's possible for them in life. So if we're all meant to, well, let me ask you this: are we all meant to individuate, to undergo this transformation?
Well, By definition, yes. In other words, the acorn is meant to be the oak tree. That's its nature. We all have a nature that seeks to unfold and express itself, to exfoliate into the world. Not many acorns become oak trees because they're at the mercy of all kinds of conditions of climate, of light and moisture and fertile soil and the impact of humans and so forth. So you can realize that individuation is a kind of ideal, and it's not synonymous with consciousness. It includes consciousness, but it's also where there's the sort of deep recesses of one's being are somehow engaged and honored. So just to choose an obvious example, let's say a person has a particular talent, but they grew up in a family where it was just not acceptable, or where there was no opportunity to pursue these things. Well, what happens to that talent? What happens to that calling? Or people are caught in gender restrictions or racial restrictions, or something where social definitions prevail over their natural developmental process. They can't really express themselves because their social climate will not allow that. Well, history's been full of that, as we know. And so this is why human misery has always been showing up, because, again, there's some imposition of the world upon the natural developmental process of that acorn that's struggling to become the oak tree. So the answer to the question is yes, all of us are meant to serve, again, not ego consciousness per se, because my development may put me in harm's way. And that's something that everybody has to experience as a kind of internal conflict. Speaking as a card-carrying introvert, for example, I've lived an extroverted life, but it's because I've been in service to a certain mission, which has been public education for several decades now. And so public education is something that is of sufficient value to me that I'm willing to override my inherent shyness and apprehensions around public disclosure. My school teachers as a child were my heroes, because those dear ladies, plus a neighborhood librarian, offered to me a larger world. They saw in me something worth affirming, and I look back upon that as the real place of my nurturance, and where I got some sense that there's a big world out there, and maybe, just maybe, you can go out and explore parts of it. And I have been identified with education ever since.
Excellent. So assuming that a person is able to kind of navigate this first phase of the individuation process and begins to confront the unconscious, right? The personal unconscious, and they're able to integrate the shadow. What does that lead to, and what happens internally to their energy systems?
Well, for one thing, we'll never integrate the shadow. It's as large as the universe, any more than we would integrate the unconscious. I often define, first of all, the ego as a thin wafer floating on iridescent ocean, and that ocean is the unconscious. And it can easily overwhelm consciousness and possess it. And it happens to us all the time. There are clusters of energy in that unconscious that, when triggered, come up and take over ego consciousness. That's what happens when we fall victim to a complex. And we all have complexes. A word complex here from the original German means simply a structure, like airport complex, apartment complex. So if you, as an infant, walk up and touch that hot iron, you now have a story. You now have an experience. And how is that going to play out in your overall understanding of self and world? Does that make you frightened of every shiny object? Does it protect you? Does it limit you? How does that get internalized? That seems like a trivial example, but you take those examples multiplied by the thousands, and you realize that the interpsychic life is swarming with clusters of energy that we have around everything: riding a bicycle, learning to use skates, etc. All of these things, and not to mention our relationships to other people, which are fraught with significance for obvious reasons. So again, underneath all of this is this nascent soul that is wishing expression and acceptance in the world, and may have to fight through a lot of obstacles to get there.
See, so it's more of a coming to terms with the shadow, or kind of coming to terms with that tension between persona and shadow.
It means a kind of continuing conversation the rest of one's life. And again, let's not associate shadow with evil. Our biggest shadow issue, as Jung pointed out, is that we live small lives. And that's a significant statement, I think, that our understandable need for safety, satiety, for security, these things can prevail, and we can collude with shutting down our own talents or callings or capacities. And, as the old saying has, not many people on their deathbed look back and say, well, I wish I had spent more time at the office or something like that. It's usually like, I wish I'd undertaken that trip that I always wanted to take, or I wish I'd started painting when I really wanted to, or I wish I'd spent more time with my children. Whatever form it takes, there is a shadow issue for that individual. Why is it that you're blocked from doing that? What keeps you from seeing that in the first place? Those are shadow issues. And living a small, protected, adaptive life is understandable. There are parts of us that are drawn to that. But again, what if your inner life calls you to journey of one kind or another? Emily Dickinson took a lot of journeys, but she never left home, so to speak, in a physical sense. But she certainly traveled psychospiritually. So, she did that at some price from her own family and her community. And if she hadn't, we would never have heard of her. And it doesn't mean that we're here to achieve celebrity or anything like that. That can be very superficial and delusive. It's rather that what if the voice that you're looking to express or embody is never heard in this world? Among writers, for example, there's a cliche: you have to find your own voice. What does that mean? Well, young writers start out trying to emulate Hemingway or Fitzgerald or Barthelme or one of these current writers, and it's flat and imitative because it's not their voice. How do you find your voice? You have to somehow risk that, and when you do that, you step into your greater capacity. So individuation is about finding your voice in life and speaking it wherever it's to be spoken.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see why Jung says somewhere that confronting your shadow requires great moral courage.
Yeah, that's right. Sure. He gave a lecture at Yale University in 1937, and he said, if you could imagine a person courageous enough to take on their own shadow, he said, that person is saddled now with a new problem. And I'm paraphrasing you here.
Mm-hmm.
That person's problem is he or she can no longer say they do this or that. They are at fault at this. One has to be able to see the same within oneself. The wisest thing ever said about the shadow was by the Latin playwright Terence, who said, nothing human is alien to me. Nothing human is alien to me. So I have to accept that the murderer, the beggar, the cheat, the liar, and the saint are all intrapsychic aspects of my personality. And if I'm in denial of them, then they're operating unconsciously, either by unconscious behaviors, or I have certain projections on certain kinds of people. I'm drawn to them or I'm repelled by them because they're carrying my shadow. Another good definition was from Jesus, who said, I can see the speck in your eye, but I'm missing the log in my own eye. You see, I can see your problems and your hesitations and your blockages, but I'm not addressing my own. And that's, again, shadow material.
Yeah. So it appears to then to shift the focus from this kind of seeing the world as separate and independent of our mind to understanding that, well, I'm participating in the creation and the meaning of my experience of life.
That's true. That's true. And what do we bring to this mixture of natural forces? Jung said we bring the capacity for consciousness. He told a wonderful story about being on an expedition in Africa. It was either in Uganda or Kenya at the time. And one morning he got up before his party, walked out and stood on the veldt just at dawn. And he said, I felt as if I'd entered into a new time-space relationship. I felt I was in the first place, a kind of Edenic arena. And he talks about these great herds of animals drifting by timelessly, and cries of the scavenger birds looking for prey and so forth. And he said, I had this overwhelming sense of why I had been brought to this mix, that our task here is to bring consciousness to brute being. That is to say, make nature conscious in some way. And then, of course, the question is, what do we do with that consciousness? That's another whole different story. But it's at least an interesting thought that the human animal has evolved. Its brain has developed over many, many millennia, and now is capable of enormous beauty and compassion on the one hand, and terrifying violence and oppression on the other hand.
Yeah, so this leads to the second question regarding the collective unconscious, right? Because the personal unconscious is where the shadow is housed, essentially our personal history and
Right.
and all the personal complexes. As we move or as we go deeper into the psyche through introspection and that kind of really questioning the nature and the purpose of our life, uh, we start to tap into these deeper layers of the unconscious mind that Jung called the collective unconscious. Could you elaborate and tell us a little bit more about how do we use that layer? How do we relate to that deeper layer of the unconscious mind?
Well, what Jung means by the collective unconscious is what is common to our species. I just referenced us, we as humans, to one branch of an evolutionary tree that developed increased cognition for good and for ill in the world. I mean, for ill, look at our ecological crisis in which we find ourselves was created by us, not by animals, not
Right.
by plants. It's created by us. So we're a problematic animal here. But the collective unconscious is represents the core factory of images, if you will. That is to say, you could dream tonight a dream that is virtually identical to a dream dreamt millennia ago. Why? Because our symbol making faculty is pretty much the same. We know that there are certain tendencies in human behavior that are predictable. If you look to the houses of government or the houses of religion and so forth, you'll find enormous conflict and disarray in our time. And that's because these conflicts are playing out. The same old mistakes are made, the same old temptations are present. And what is done in one millennium is repeated in another one, or ripples through the generations. We know that. The evidence is obvious. You just have to be a student of that. And when you begin to realize that, then you realize humanity over the last few thousand years hasn't changed much. Our technology's changed, our social structures have changed, our social values, our stories have changed. The human psyche is pretty much the same. You know, there's something in us that we can find in our brother Oedipus, or our sister Antigone. There's something that these ancient playwrights were able to identify as lying at the core of human temptation on the one hand and the human capacity for transformation on the other hand. And that is common to us as well. So when we study these things, it's not a study in the antique, it's a study in the contemporaneity of the symbol making formation that each of us has. And for example, an obvious archetypal, and an archetype is really the structuring process of these images. One of the most common of archetypal expressions is the idea of the journey. It's something I allude to frequently. It's like we're always in motion towards something. Every morning we rise facing an archetypal struggle. On the one hand, as I've noted in various books, at the foot of the bed are two gremlins. One is called fear, the other is called lethargy, and both want to eat you up for today. Fear says it's too much for you, it's too challenging, you can't manage it. Lethargy says, chill out, tomorrow's another day, have some chocolate. And the summons is to shut up and show up, step into that and, stand on your own 2 feet and live your life as fully as you can that day. And every day, that archetypal struggle is there between progression and regression. And also, and as Jung wrote back in 1912, he said, the spirit of evil, which is strong language, the spirit of evil is negation of the life force by fear. Only boldness can deliver us from fear. And if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is violated. That's pretty clear. Now, nobody enjoys fear, quite the contrary. But does fear govern your life? Does it make your decisions for you? Where do you step in and fight the good fight against it? We may never get rid of those fears, but we still have to live our life in the face of them. It's one thing to, have fears. It's something else to have a fearful life. It's quite different. And that's the kind of struggle all of us go through. And that's a kind of timeless struggle. All human beings have had to deal with it. There's a marvelous passage in Marcus Aurelius's accounts when he's on the frontier fighting the I think the Teutonic forces. And he says to himself, I want to stay in bed this morning. It's cold out there. And then he says, but what have you been called to do with your life? It's not to come here and pull the blanket over your head. It's to get up and stand for, what you stand for in the face of what is such a threat to your life and well-being. So, these are images and tendencies that come from the collective unconscious. They are timeless. And again, they can be found as we study the scriptures and the artworks and the religious traditions of the ancient world.
Yeah, which brings us to today. These institutions, these kind of traditional practices have seemed to have fallen away, and people, they don't have something to replace them. It's replaced by materialism, by consumerism, by hedonism, instead of a genuine social structure to take people through the kind of a transformational process. Mm-hmm. What do you think we can do about that? How do we get back on track?
Well, that's a very good question. And I don't think there's an answer to it, but I certainly would suggest a couple of notions here. First of all, the purpose of an institution is very valid. It's to try to preserve a respected experience of some kind and to transmit it to the subsequent generations. That's what an institution does. Of course, as you get further and further from the original experiences that gave rise to that institution, it's harder and harder to transmit it, and it's replaced by, structural values. And, the law of institutions is in time, the primary purpose of the institution evolves to the point that it is to preserve the institution itself, even at the expense, perhaps, of the original inspiring experiences. And secondly, to protect its priesthood of whatever kind it might be. It could be in academia, it could be in churches, it could be in government, whatever. And so again, the purpose of those experiences was to link people to the four orders of mystery, the mystery of the cosmos. Why are we here? What's the purpose of this universe? Is there a universe? Are there gods? What is their intention for us? How are we to behave toward them? What happens after our death? These are timeless questions. They don't go away. But the capacity of a local culture and or institution to effectively mediate them, that is to say, where it actually produces a felt change or experience within the person, wanes over the subsequent generations. The second order of mystery is the mystery of nature. How are we to live in harmony with nature rather than in opposition to it? Thirdly is a social perspective. Who are my people? Who is my tribe? Where is my home? And to what degree do I stay within that tradition, or to what degree do I depart from it? Again, based on the individuation imperative. And fourthly is the individual or psychological task. Who am I as a person separate from, say, my siblings or my ancestors? And how am I to govern my life? How do I make choices? And by what perspectives and standards do I make choices? Those are the timeless questions, the timeless spheres of engagement. And the question then is, do the images available from my culture help me mediate for that or feel served by that? And the truth is, in our time, and it's been happening over the last 2 centuries, there's a waning of the power of the institutions to effectively mediate that. And therefore, individuals will fall back either into the unconscious or turn outwardly to popular culture. And as you just suggested, the operative religions of our time in terms of popular culture are materialism, the fantasy that if my spiritual emptiness can be assuaged by purchasing an object of some kind. Now, if that works, we would know it by now, and it doesn't, or it works only for a short length of time, which then generates the need to keep buying something, becomes an addiction. Secondly, hedonism, the search for pleasure as opposed to meaning. And thirdly, narcissism, self-absorption. Sure. Everything we're talking about in terms of individuation is not narcissism. Ironically, narcissism is about buttressing a weak ego. A true narcissist is an empty person. A true narcissist looks in the mirror and no one stares back. So this is not narcissism or self-absorption. This is about the ego serving something that is worthy of its service, that's a different question. And one of the things that one has to ask is, what is worthy of my service? My own answer through the years, as I've already suggested, has always been education. I've always been interested in learning and sharing what that learning is about. And I think that it was so meaningful in my own life. And why would I not want to share that with others? And that's something that is innate to me, and it's not necessarily to someone else. They have their own summons, their own appointments with the soul. And the question is, of course, will they show up for that appointment?
Incredible. Jung was always talking about the tension between these opposing dualities, the persona and the shadow, the conscious and the unconscious. Is it that through individuation we move from the tension between the persona and the shadow, the personal unconscious, into this larger sphere of seeing that we're part of a bigger process of the individual and the collective, kind of the tension between what does it mean for me to be an individual in this larger collective of humanity?
That's right. And by asking that question, you're really being determined that this is not a narcissistic endeavor. It's really about service, because in the second half of life, the service you're asked for is to give your energy to something that really matters. It could be your relationships with other people. I've also been a therapist through these years, and both as a teacher and as a therapist and as a writer. These are forms of service as I see them. I don't see them as much as self-expression as they are being a vehicle, or a mediator between the material that we're looking at, the material of the unconscious, the material of history, whatever the source is at the moment, and trying to interpret that, to facilitate that as an experiential engagement for the individual. And that's a dynamic process for other people. The question is, what is worth your service? I've had so many people through the years say, well, I always wanted to learn the piano. I always wanted to learn Italian or Spanish or something like that. So you have to ask the question, so why didn't you? Well, they're usually excuses. I didn't have the money, I had the children, did this. All true. Yeah. And yet there's the appointment with the soul that was not kept. That's the problem. Why didn't I keep my appointment with my own soul on those issues? So as the painter Chuck Close said, who just passed away last year, actually, he said, a lot of artists think you have to wait for inspiration. He said, professionals don't. They show up early at the studio and get to work. And that's true. So, 100% of the writing that I've done through the years has been at the end of a workday. It's not like I was sitting in some cushy position where I could just, write, to my heart's content. It was always, I had to earn a living like every other person. And I did that as a psychotherapist. But then the writing comes in the evenings. And that means sacrificing one's need for rest, for diversion, etc. But is the sacrifice worth it? That's the key. What's worthy of your sacrifice? Because if you don't sacrifice to something worthy, you're sacrificing to something that in the end is not worthy, that won't serve in any way to enhance your journey or the journey that you share with others.
Yeah, I had never thought of it that way. It kind of gets at what is the meaning of purpose, right? When we say it's the purpose of my life, well, it's something that's worthy of my sacrifice. Yes. And that I can devote my energy to it.
Yes. And as the word suggests, sacra and facere, to make sacred, it means that an ordinary thing, just opening a door for a person or being thoughtful around someone else, might in fact make it sacred at that moment, you see, where it taps into a value that's other than the transactional relationship of our relationships. Where it taps into some other life of the spirit. And in those moments, then you see your spiritual presence in this world, even in all of its material demands upon us.
So we get to self, right? Because Jung always emphasized this, that the aim, let's say, of individuation is the self, in essence. We want to get to this, I love the way you put it, this transcendent organic wisdom of nature that is our true self. Can you elaborate a little bit more and tell us what do we experience, and what should we expect, and why should we sacrifice and try to do this individuation process? What happens when we experience the self?
Well, first of all, we as animals share with other species biological drives, and we also have social needs, our need to have a relatedness to others, a tribal sense. But thirdly is, again, this indefinable issue of meaning, or the life of the spirit. When you encounter the self, you will feel a connection to something that's transcendent to the ego consciousness, and you'll feel the support of that. On a very practical basis, let me suggest it this way. We have tons of evidence every day about how to conduct our life, and yet we often lead confused and disabling lives. And I'll give examples. First of all, is the feeling function. I mean, we all know about that, but we don't realize you don't choose your feelings. Feelings are autonomous, qualitative analyses of your life as experienced by the psyche. You can ignore your feelings, you can anesthetize them, you can project them onto others, you can do a lot of things. You can be possessed by them. But feelings tell you, in other words, let's say you're in this career that your education and your work has prepared you for. And one day you realize you're just profoundly bored out of your mind, but you can't afford to indulge in that feeling because, you know, you have an income, you have a family to support, you have whatever. But you see, underneath, your psyche has already registered its vote as to how you're spending your life. Secondly, we have energy systems. When you're doing what's right for you, the energy of the self supports you. We can mobilize energy in service to survival and adaptation needs, and that's good. That way we're able to get up at 3 a.m. and change the diaper of the baby. That's essential. But if you continue to evoke your energy over time in the wrong places, it leads inevitably to burnout and exhaustion, depression, self-medication, and so forth. Thirdly, we have dreams, and dreams are autonomous, qualitative analyses also of our life as observed by the self, capital S, and they confront the ego on a regular basis. I learned recently that if you live to 80 years old, astonishingly, 6 years of your life out of 80 will be spent dreaming. Think of that. Not sleeping, but dreaming.
Dream.
Nature is not wasting energy, it's serving a purpose. And I think one of the purposes of dreaming is to metabolize the massive stimuli that occur to us in every given 24-hour period. It's more than we can handle, so it has to continue to process that. But secondly, to comment upon, if you pay attention to your dreams over time, you realize there's some kind of intelligence there that's outside the sphere of the ego. It can borrow and steal from contemporary imagery into contemporary culture, but it is autonomous. You don't create your dreams, they come to you. Try to have a dream about hamburgers or something like that tonight, and your psyche is not going to pay any attention to you. It'll attend its agenda, and the only question is, are you paying attention? Fourthly, over time, is that question of meaning. If what you're doing is meaningful, the energy will be there. The feeling function will support that. That's why I've been, as I said, teaching for 50, 60 years now. That's a lot of teaching, but the psyche has continued to support it through the years. The day it doesn't, it's the day I'll start doing something else. And last of all is psychopathology. When we're off track, the psyche is going to show up and knock on our door, and if we ignore it, it'll knock more stridently until we're forced to address it. I was blessed, as I now say, and I wouldn't have said at the time when I was at midlife, having achieved everything that I wanted to achieve at that understanding of things. I had a significant life depression, and it sent me to my first hour of therapy. It wasn't as if I was starting the second half of life and was going to make major changes in my life. It was sort of like with a sense of futility, like I've done everything I thought I was supposed to do. And why is it not working right? Why does it not feel okay within? And that was a healthy question. I didn't understand at the time. At the time, I wanted to just get rid of the depression as anybody else would. But that's why we could gravitate to medications or 5 easy steps to this or that. The real question to be asked at that point is, why has your psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the agenda that your ego consciousness is trying to enact in the world? That's the real question. And if we continue to ask that in an honest and thorough and disciplined way, you will begin to find some answers that come back to you.
Yeah, that perspective is very different than the typical clinical model in psychology that sees the depression as a chemical imbalance or something like that.
And let me say, there are occasions in which a depression arises out of a chemical imbalance, and we're going to address it that way. But part of what one has to do is differential diagnosis. In other words, you can have multiple sources of a depression. And if you treat only one of them, then you're going to miss the larger point here. And yes, modern psychotherapy has fractionated the person into pharmacology, which is to say neurobiology, actions that we take, and thoughts that we have, cognitive processes,
Right.
all of which we have. But we're more than that. That's the point. We're more than that. So if it's a question of a Band-Aid for a certain issue, that's one thing, or changing some maladaptive behaviors, that's helpful. But if you're really talking about the journey of your life and what your life means and what it's about and what choices you need to make, that's a different kind of inquiry. And that's where depth psychology begins. I have to tell you a funny story. Last year I was in the hospital, and just before a rather painful procedure, a nurse said to me, now go to your happy place. And I said, this is my happy place, right? She didn't think that was very funny. But then she said, to try and distract me, I think, she said, now, how does being an analyst differ from a psychiatrist? And I said, well, for one thing, psychiatrists will tend to give medication, and a psychoanalyst will try to ask other kinds of questions, and we try to evoke a conversation with the unconscious. She thought about that for a while, and she said, oh, I see you work with people in a coma. Yeah. And I thought that was funny. And we went ahead with the procedure. So it's true to say that when we're in service to a cultural image, or we're in service to our internalization and our encrusted story of it, which is to say a complex, we may in fact be living a state of possession, metaphorically. We're possessed by that intrapsychic content. And so we could say, by extending that metaphor, in a way, one can live so unconsciously one's in a coma, so to speak. You go through the motions.
Right.
Kierkegaard talked about a man who was shocked to find his name in the obituary column of the Copenhagen Tagblad, or whatever the title of the paper is. And he said he didn't realize that he had died because he didn't realize he'd been here in the first place. Lived a life of stimulus response and autonomous enactments. And that's the unconscious life.
Yeah. So that's the tragedy of life, right? That people are given this opportunity to experience their true self in life, but they get stuck in this over identification with the persona, with the role that they're playing in society. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that, right? We need to fit in. We need to do work and establish ourselves in society. But that deeper calling is really what we're here for, right? It's what really gives meaning to our life.
Sure, and I'm sure someone who's watching or listening would say, this sounds very good, it's very idealistic, and most people, as Thoreau said, lead lives of quiet desperation, and that's absolutely true. Throughout history, most people have been defined by their environment, the tribe they're born into, the historic conditions they have to serve, and so forth. And so it's another whole layer of human misery and of the separation from one's own soul. In our time, we can say, for example, the family structure, as historically meant, this is a modality of survival. The more children you have, the more likely you are to survive. The more hands you have to hunt for food or till the soil. Today, we would say the basic function of the family would be to serve as a kind of platform for the growth, development, affirmation of the individual, so they can live a fuller life. And that's quite a different definition of family in a different historic setting. And it's certainly not true for most people on the planet for whom survival is the daily agenda. So I don't want to sound idealistic. I'm simply saying, therefore, the souls that are caught in those structures that are so oppressive are going to live miserable lives. And I have the deepest sympathy and a hope for them. And I think about them all the time. I start with my own parents, for example, for whom economic survival was everything. That basically the Depression defined their lives, in World War II. Those were circumstances over which they had no control, and to which they had to report. And so the world that they lived in had to do with you. You get a job, you hang on, and no matter how soul killing it is, you hang on at any cost, because without it, you'll perish. And I know my father had terrible headaches as a result of conflict within, but he never had, sadly, permission to break free from it. And I can tell you stories of other families, certainly, but again, does the family, does the structure around support the individual, or does it in some way call for the sort of ritual sacrifice of the individual in service to whatever the collective experiences are?
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's something that lies outside of our control. What lies within our control is, the choices we make internally, whether we're outwardly free or not. That's why one of my heroes has always been Nelson Mandela. When he was imprisoned unjustly in the prime of his life, and he and his colleagues decided their bodies were imprisoned, but their spirits would not be. And they chose to teach their captors to read and write, for example. And I think this is a magnificent triumph of the spirit. And so when they left the island to go back to so-called normal society, those who had been their captors, had considered them helpful agents in their lives. That says something about the life of the spirit and the choices we can make.
Yeah, talk about moral courage, right? That exemplifies it so well. Deborah is itching to jump into the conversation, if you don't mind.
Please, Deborah.
Hi, Dr. Hollis. I absolutely loved your book. I love that you wrote it in the casual tone, like you said. It was so nice for me to really capture the brilliance of your work and, the work of Jung. One of the things I read in your book that I thought was really interesting is why people stay stuck. And you had said something to the effect about that's two reasons, and one is abandonment and the other one is overwhelm. And I would love for you to elaborate a little bit on that, because I absolutely love that, just to keep it simple. This is the two main things that keep people stuck.
Sure. Well, first of all, everyone has some stuck places in their life, and you stop and ask a person, now tell me where you feel you're stuck. And if they think about it beyond the first sentence or two, they'll come up with an example. And if we can identify so readily where we're stuck, why is it we can't get unstuck? And the answer is, the moment we start moving in the direction of getting unstuck, we activate some archaic field of anxiety that is something within us. And there are two categorical threats to our survival and well-being: overwhelmment by the world. And of course, the message that we all got as children, and it was factual, was that the world's big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. So you better figure out a way to deal with powers of that world. And, avoiding it and being compliant with it are their usual strategies. And secondly, abandonment. Without the other, we would perish also. And so there's a tremendous terror of being isolated and alone and so forth. Now, if one can go into the depths there and say, to get unstuck, I would have to do X or Y or Z. Let's just say dieting. It's a person wants to lose weight. Okay, they're using food as a form of self-medication. It's very common because food produces chemical changes in us. And it may be that person's go-to strategy to deal with their emotional life, all right? Well, if I let go of that, what's going to be there for me? Then I experience abandonment. There's no other there to solace me. Or then I'll have to face the magnitude of tasks that lie before me without my self-medication and without my retreat zone. So you can see why it becomes preferable to stay stuck, because then the question is, what will I have to take on to get unstuck? And many times what we have to take on is something very open and obvious, and we can handle it, because the wiring that goes from that archaic field of anxiety, it was essentially generated, in our childhoods, and it comes up and has the capacity to shut the ego down. And to say, all right, but there is also a person who has shown up in my life who can handle this. First of all, many of the issues I fear, for example, a person might say, oh, if I open my mouth, I'll lose the love and support of the other, or I'll be out there on my own, I'll be alone. Well, maybe that will happen, maybe it won't. Chances are it won't, but if it happened, maybe that's the price of stepping into your own journey. And there's an adult on the scene, that's you, that has the resilience, range of options, and depth of experience to cope with that in a way the child could not. So stuck places are good places to begin to explore the unconscious.
Like realizing you're stuck is actually a good thing.
Sorry?
Realizing you're stuck.
Oh, that's the first step to realize.
Yeah.
Yes. And secondly, to say, all right, what would it take to be unstuck?
Mhm.
What anxiety? Because if I can say I'm stuck, I've already made a judgmental statement about it. You know, I'm not wanting to advance myself as here's a very stuck person, right?
Mhm.
It's rather these are the places where the old anxieties have their way with me, because I am still a servant to the anxiety that they generate. And if I can take that on, then I again step into my larger human journey.
When I was in the corporate world in about, in my late 30s, I was feeling I wanted to do something else with my life, but I was afraid to leave my corporate, comforts. And I got laid off. It was like taken away. So I remember saying to myself, I just want to see what I'm made of. And it was like this kind of like inside of me. I don't know where it came from, but this like part of me is like, let's just try it. Like there's nothing to lose. Like you're playing like, there's nothing to lose. I think it's like a boldness that you have to take toward this to override the ego's fears.
That's right. That's why the Jungian quote I mentioned before, only boldness can deliver us from fear. And if the meaning is not taken, if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is violated. And there was a moment where, in a way, fate entered and said, all right, Deborah, we're going to put you in a new situation, and this is going to be it's a loss. And notice corporations related to corpus, the body. It's like, as long as I'm connected to the body, I'm nourished and I'm safe.
I love that. Yeah.
And I'm separated, which is birth, after all. I'm not there on my own. And yet nature has equipped us with the same resources and energies that have timelessly been there. And, another way of putting this is, why would I think that the strength and resilience that allowed my ancestors to survive on this planet would not be present within me as well? The difference being today is I have information available to me they did not have and could have imagined. And secondly, I have a cultural milieu in which there's far, far greater opportunity for the expression of the self than the closed societies that most humanity has experienced heretofore.
It's beautiful. Like that idea you said about it. I always say there's no place to fall. Like you can't fall anywhere because spirit will catch you wherever you are. And you had said that in your book. And I was like, oh, like I must have been channeling your ideas. But yeah, it really is. There's so many people that live that life of, that persona. And Jung's work, the theory of individuation, has changed my life. That's why Rob and I are so dedicated to inspire people to take the journey, because it's painful not to.
Yeah, it's painful to take it, but it's more painful not to. That's something you need to know. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you think that life is difficult now, imagine your life at the end and say, but I wasn't really here. I didn't do what was wanting to be done through me in this life. And you don't want to be in that position, I suspect.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Well, we want to be mindful of your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Hollis, for taking the time to be here with us.
And we know that our listeners are going to really enjoy this interview and buy your book, A Life of Meaning, Relocating Your Center of Spiritual Gravity. Amazing, amazing book.
Thank you.
Highly recommend it. Great, great read. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you, and I wish you well.
Thank you. Bye-bye. What an incredible interview with Dr. Hollis.
Yeah. Yeah, he's very generous with his time and his knowledge. We definitely encourage you to get the book, A Life of Meaning, Relocating Your Center of Spiritual Gravity.
It's a great book, and it's written in a really cool way. He's very common, more relaxed language than his typical book. So those of you who are new to Jung or new to the individuation process, I think you'll really enjoy it. So before we go, I do want to remind you to, if you're watching us on YouTube, click the button here in the corner to subscribe to our channel. So on behalf of Rob and I, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.